Hey, everybody. Welcome into a special edition of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And unlike Mike, not in a palatial hotel coming to you from Pennsylvania, I'm Nick Saveri.
That's right, palatial hotel, because that's what happens when you go on TV, Nick, to analyze a race that could have been called days ago, weeks ago, months ago, who knows? But joining us to break it all down, somebody who is steeped in New Hampshire culture, former executive director of the New Hampshire Republican Party up there, advisor to Governor Christie. He worked at the State Department. He's the president of Valcor. You too many jobs, Matt. Matt Mowers joins us here on the show. Well, Matt, good to see you, buddy. Mike and Nick, thanks for hopping on with us.
Yeah, you too, guys. No, appreciate you having me on. Especially a big night for us up here in New Hampshire. I was just with the New Hampshire Republican Party actually at the Goat, which is a bar in Manchester, and so a lot of folks buzzing tonight, of course.
So, Matt, let's get into that because, you know, I alluded to it and I joked about it, but you and I were talking a few weeks ago, and you truly are plugged into New Hampshire. And from all accounts, the early returns now are that the former president is probably going to win between 8 to 12 percentage points here. What's your readout as you've been in the state for the last couple of days? Like, what's your readout on Trump's victory, what you were hearing for voters? Did this kind of go the way you expected, or is it not a surprise to any of us?
Yeah, look, I wish I had written it down in text to some folks, but what do you think is going to happen? I kept saying about 8 to 12, and to hear you say that's kind of funny. Now, I will say the one surprise I had is that I do think Nikki Haley's number is higher than most folks anticipated. If you looked at most of the public polls that came out, she was polling somewhere in the mid 30s, high 30s. A lot of us thought maybe she could get in the low 40s. But for her to, at the moment, I think she's hovering around 45% or so. To get into the mid 40s shows she really did consolidate and then energize a lot of voters to show up in this election. A lot of folks who truly weren't captured by the public polling. We saw polls as recently as just the past few days where the sample was 47% unaffiliated voters. So, essentially an independent voter, a voter who chooses not to be part of the Republican or Democratic Party. It looks like we might be on track to almost being 50%. Some of the exit polling is still being broken down right now. So what it tells me is this: it shows that she capitalized off of a clear lane as the non-Trump candidate, but at the same time, Donald Trump in a state where arguably he should be the weakest. If you look at it, you have a popular Republican governor who endorses his opponent. You have an open primary where independents can participate in either primary. No active primary on the Democratic side because Joe Biden skipped over the primary per DNC rules. It shows that Trump still has some strength even in some challenging states for him. But then it also does show a little bit of upside for Nikki Haley. I think she has enough tonight to justify moving forward, justify calling donors and voters and telling them she's going to run into South Carolina and continue to try to accumulate delegates and play a long game here.
Matt, as you were talking about, let's talk about New Hampshire for a second. When we think about New Hampshire politics, the three of the last Republicans to win the New Hampshire primary all went on, to the general election. So obviously New Hampshire has a pulse to the GOP. In just from the work you've done and what you know about the state, what makes up a New Hampshire Republican as opposed to perhaps at the national level, what we see in Florida, obviously what's going on right now with Oklahoma and what the governor is trying to do with, having a, libs for TikTok person on their education board. In New Hampshire, what feels different about the party?
Well, so, a lot of folks will talk about and should talk about the role that independent voters played in the primary. But if you look at even the Republican Party itself, you have a significantly higher number of self-identified moderate Republicans. If you actually poll on the question of abortion, you have a significant number of Republicans who identify as pro-choice. Majority still identify as pro-life, but it's usually about a 60-40 issue. And in the Republican Party, whereas in most states, even very blue states, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, sometimes it's 85% of Republicans identify as pro-life. So you do have a very different type of Republican voter in New Hampshire. It's largely a pretty well-educated state. It's a state that has pretty high income levels comparatively. And not only that, you also have a strong libertarian bent within the Republican Party. I mean, after all, we're the live free or die state. We take it pretty seriously. No income tax, no sales tax. We like our government to be small and out of the way. And so that impacts politics not just at the local level, but certainly at the federal level, both in federal races, but also particularly in the New Hampshire Republican primary.
Matt, I kind of want to stay on something you just said there because, Nikki Haley gave, a concession-ish speech, where I like to call it, around 8:40 or so up there in New Hampshire. And you just mentioned it before that, depending upon where the margin of victory kind of nets out here, that she does have a little bit of life and juice that could take her to South Carolina. Whereas national media, maybe national convention would say, the math's not mathing here because some of these other states coming up, Nevada, South Carolina, and Michigan in February, she's not projected to win. And she hasn't gotten any of the endorsements of some of the big people in South Carolina. So I'm curious, as you've been in New Hampshire, as you've been talking to voters, are you hearing the Nikki Haley message and the platform resonating? And do you truly think that resignation, or whatever the margin of victory nets out here, she can take it to somebody in South Carolina and say, look, I know I lost, but I only lost by this much, and that's why you should vote for me coming up in South Carolina?
I do think so. I mean, and not only that, but folks get out of races because they run out of money. That's not going to be the issue for Nikki Haley. And in fact, her campaign would argue that part of the reason her numbers are not as competitive with Donald Trump's in these states is that they haven't spent money in states much past New Hampshire. They actually were the number one spender in the state. They put a ton of resources into the state, not just her campaign money, but also her super PAC, Stand for America, Americans for Prosperity, that supports her, has a significant and robust and longstanding operation here in New Hampshire. Not only do they spend in the mailbox, on TV, on digital, but they had an entire grassroots army that they mobilized for her to go door to door. And it's one that's been cultivated over the course of the last decade. And so, what they would say is that they have not put those resources to use in, well, certainly Nevada. Nevada is going to be, kind of a sideshow. Donald Trump will win the caucus, which is where the delegates are chosen. Nikki Haley filed for the primary. So technically, they're not even going to be running against each other. So both of them will claim a win, but only Donald Trump will take delegates from Nevada. But really what comes down to South Carolina. And so, her campaign announced they're doing a $4 million ad buy. And I believe they've wired the first couple million into that already. And she goes there tomorrow night for a big rally where one would expect she's going to, claim that she has a head of steam. I think it was really telling that they had Nikki Haley go out there and speak right around 8:30 or so, pretty early in the night, in order to set the momentum and the message for her campaign. I think they recognized that the numbers were coming in early were very close. I mean, at one point she was only down by about 7-8 points, which, a lot of folks would say you're still down. But as you and I know, and Nick, I know you know as well, that, expectations have to exceed reality in politics. And in this case, reality has to exceed expectations in politics. In that case, it would have, but they had her out there early, kind of claiming a moral victory here. And so she'll set the tone. They'll claim that if they start spending money in South Carolina, Michigan, for example, which is before Super Tuesday, is another open primary state, and then a whole host of Super Tuesday states in March, that she's going to get better known, better acquainted, and that her message will have resonance with voters in those states as well.
Matt, earlier when you were talking about New Hampshire politics, for the Republican Party, the person you describe as a New Hampshire Republican doesn't necessarily fall into the MAGA Trump supporter that we tend to think of when we talk about national news, or at least the perception. You obviously have worked alongside Governor Christie. Is there a concern now within the party that Trump has such a hold on it that even in a state like New Hampshire with a well-educated populace, that as far as Republicans go, they'll still overwhelmingly lean toward him when, well, for no other reason other than to sort of continue with sort of momentum at the national level?
No, I mean, I think the concern would be if Donald Trump becomes the nominee. I mean, look, he and his campaign are going to have their work cut out for them to reach out to these moderate Republicans, independent voters who are lean Republican, folks who may have been turned off by rhetoric or personality, that they have to win them back over somehow. Some of them will fall in anyway. I mean, a lot of folks who voted for Nikki Haley, should Donald Trump become the nominee, they'll go and vote for him, right? Because we're in such a partisan environment, and so many folks kind of put on their red jersey or their blue jersey. But I think it does show that he's going to have some real outreach he's going to need to do. You saw him on election night in Iowa start trying to do that. He was much more mellow. He was extending an olive branch to both Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. He was somewhat conciliatory in his remarks, very uncharacteristically. Of course, the next day he was back on the campaign trail and doing what he felt like he needed to do to win the primary. But I do think it shows that he recognizes he's going to have to extend an olive branch to a different part of the party in order to unite them. And what will be really telling, that should he be the nominee, is who he'll choose as his vice presidential nominee. I mean, I worked for his campaign in the general election of 2016. I remember when he chose Mike Pence. Ended up being a smart political play. If you looked at polling back in the day, he was hitting his mark he needed with blue collar Democrats at that point and independents. Where Donald Trump was falling short against Hillary Clinton was actually evangelical voters who had overwhelmingly supported Ted Cruz, who had not come to comfort yet with voting with Donald Trump. And so choosing Mike Pence, using him as a high profile surrogate, consistently won a lot of those voters over. And it actually pulled a broad coalition together that needed to win that election. He's going to have to look to do the same, in probably a bit of a different sort of way for this November. I mean, he certainly has evangelicals in the bank for his campaign right now. He'll have to reach out to suburban voters, folks of color, and certainly independent women as well.
Matt, before we let you go, I did want to, as the president right now, as we're recording, is giving his speech, and he's got all the folks behind him, like Senator Tim Scott, Vivek Ramaswamy, everybody's behind him. So the party's with Trump right now, but then there's also the AT, as I like to call it, after Trump, which is something Nikki Haley has talked about, and Governor Sununu has even talked about it on the trail for Nikki Haley. It's what do you want the next 4, 8, 10, 12 years to look like after Donald Trump? So I couldn't think of anybody better to ask as a Republican insider, as somebody who's worked on some of these campaigns, including for the former president, for Governor Christie. What does the party kind of look like after Donald Trump? If Nikki Haley, who was maybe more moderate leaning and could potentially beat Joe Biden in a national head-to-head matchup, according to polling, if she couldn't even win a state like New Hampshire, which you mentioned, 40% of the folks out there are undeclared or independent that could have voted and participated in this. And a lot of people came out for Donald Trump. What does the future of this party look like post-Trump?
Well, I think there's some Republican consultants and insiders and business class that say, well, it should go back to the way it was. Well, that ain't going to happen, right? This is not going to be the party that nominated Mitt Romney in 2012. It's likely not going to be the party that nominated John McCain in 2008. What it is going to be is some consortium, though, of that. Is it going to be the party that looks at Trumpism without Trump? Does that exist? I think one thing that sometimes gets overlooked is that a lot of Republican voters, and I know this seems kind of strange to folks in the media and Democrats and some of the Beltway folks occasionally, there's a lot of Republican voters who are not really all that MAGA. They just happen to like Donald Trump. They like, whether it's his personality or the policies, they just like the guy. And, maybe it's because they were used to kind of supporting him and defending him for a number of years. So I think a number of those voters would support potentially a Nikki Haley, certainly a Ron DeSantis type of candidate in the future if Trump were not in the race. And I think they'd be very content with doing so. But you certainly have a much more populist activist base that has had a voice in Donald Trump. And I expect some of the voices that have been created in a lot of ways because of that, success of Donald Trump are going to continue to be leaders, for different factions of the party, whether it's a J.D. Vance or potentially even a Marjorie Taylor Greene, or maybe even Donald Trump Jr. himself. So it's going to be really telling in 2028. It's tough to see exactly what a post-Trump party looks like without being post-Trump. But I imagine you're going to really see that come to a head at some point in 2028. I expect it to be a robust primary, and it's going to be certainly a fun one to be part of and watch, because I think as much as you've seen reporters consistently bemoan how there isn't quite as much kinetic energy on the ground in New Hampshire, because candidly, you've got two candidates on one side and kind of half a candidate on the Democratic side. 2028 is going to be a wide open primary, and that's going to be where a lot of these battles are fought.
Couldn't agree more. Matt Mowers, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us. Nobody more plugged into the state of New Hampshire than you, my friend. Continue success and stay safe, buddy.
Mike, Nick, thanks you so much. And Have a great night, and look forward to chatting soon.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.